Well, for the past couple of weeks, we've been looking at a sermon series entitled Unlikely Heroes. We've been looking at some of the men and women from the Old Testament who were unlikely heroes. The first week, we looked at Daniel and the faith that he had. The second week, we looked at Esther and all of the struggles that she had to go through. This week, we're going to look at arguably one of the greatest military leaders of all time, Joshua. So what makes him such an unlikely hero? Well, first of all, we need to look at his background. There's not really much known about him. What we do know is that he was born an Egyptian slave, trained only to probably make bricks and to build buildings. We first catch a glimpse of him when Moses leads the people out of Egypt, and they're about to take the promised land. And Moses sends out the 12 spies to look at the promised land to see whether they believed they could take it or not. And Joshua was one of the two who said that they could take it. The other 10 were fearful. So how could a man who was born a slave, had no training in military combat, become one of the greatest military leaders in history? The answer, I think, is quite simple. God. And Joshua's willingness to overcome all of the obstacles that he faced in his life. So let us look at some of these obstacles that Joshua had to overcome. The first one is the difficulty in following in Moses' footsteps. I mean, think about how big of shoes that would have been to fill. Israel would have looked at Moses with very high esteem, because Moses was a man who talked to God face to face. He was a man who God worked miracles through and sent the plagues on the Egyptians. He was the man who led the Israelites out of slavery when they was in slavery for more than 400 years. He was the man who prayed for them and persuaded God to spare their lives, even when God wanted to destroy Israel because of their rebellious attitude. He was the one who guided them through the wilderness for 40 years. And he brought them the law. Israel would have held Moses in very high esteem. And we get another glimpse of how high they held him from a passage in Deuteronomy and also a passage in Jude. Deuteronomy 34:6 tells us that God buried Moses' body in the valley. And Jude 9 tells us that Michael contended with the devil over Moses' body. So the question is, why would God bury Moses? And why would Michael have to contend against the devil for Moses' body? I think the answer is because Israel had a habit of turning things into idols. And since Moses was thought so highly of, it is possible that they would have ended up worshiping him instead of worshiping the one who gave Moses the power and strength to do what he did. So looking at how highly the Israelites thought of Moses, could you imagine trying to fill those shoes? Could you imagine the insecurities that you would face? Imagine being terrified of failure. Imagine being fearful that they are always comparing you to Moses. Would have been difficult. Especially if you remember that 40 years before, no one really respected his opinion. They didn't respect it enough to follow his advice that they could take the promised land. So if they didn't listen to him then, why would they listen to him now? So how did Joshua overcome such an obstacle? I think because he was able to understand that there was a difference between him and his calling and Moses' calling. There was a difference between his leadership style and Moses' leadership style. I mean, think about it. Moses was called to lead the people out of Egypt to give them the law and to make for sure that the law was enforced. Now Joshua is called to become a military leader and to take the land that God had promised to Abraham many years before. If Joshua had tried to become another Moses, he would have failed. Joshua knew that he wasn't another Moses, but rather a brand new leader with a different calling and a different mission. I think that can be clearly seen in some of the similarities, but also the differences between Moses' and Joshua's call. Remember, when God called Moses, he called to him out of the burning bush, and he told him, where you are standing is holy ground, so take off your sandals. And he proceeded to tell him what his mission was. But we get Joshua's calling in Joshua chapter 5, 13 through 15. It says, when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked. And behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us, or are you for our adversaries? And he said, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? The commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. Joshua did. Now, the fact that the angel told Joshua to take off his sandals because where he is standing is holy ground would have been a vivid reminder of Moses' call. But there's a big difference. God called for Moses himself out of the burning bush. But now here's the commander of the Lord's army. Many think it's Gabriel. And he's standing there with sword in hand. It's a vivid picture of what Joshua's call was to do. To become a military leader. And to take the promised land for Israel. For us, oftentimes we struggle with comparison. We compare ourselves to others all the time. Either we compare ourselves to others within the church. We see what God has gifted other people with. And we wish we had that same gift. We see what other people are doing within the church, and that's what we want to be able to do too. But God has given us different gifts. He's given us different talents, abilities, so that we can fulfill his mission within the church. We need to stop comparing ourselves to others and celebrate our uniqueness. Paul pointed this out in 1 Corinthians 12. He said, for the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. Now you are the body of Christ, individually members of it. Each and every one of us are unique. We have different abilities, different gifts. We need to celebrate that uniqueness. But oftentimes also we compare ourselves to others within the world. Mothers may look at other mothers and see well-behaved kids, and if they've ever been to their house, see a clean house, and they're thinking, man, I wish I could be like her. I wish I could be that perfect mother. They start comparing themselves. Women oftentimes compare themselves in appearance. Well, maybe I'm not as beautiful as she is. Maybe I don't have that external beauty like her. Men compare ourselves. We look at other men's salaries and go, I can't support my family the way that he does. So maybe I'm a lesser of a man. Teens compare themselves all the time, wanting to be a part of the popular kids. always striving for popularity, always comparing themselves to others. What we need to remember is we only see what they allow us to see. We don't know what's going on the inside. We don't know the insecurities that they face. Some of the most popular kids has some of the most low self-esteem. We don't know what it's taken for them to get to where they are at, what obstacles they've had to overcome, what they have been through. We need to remember that God has made each and every one of us uniquely, so that only you can fulfill what God has called you to do. He has given you certain passions, certain gifts, and we need to celebrate our uniqueness rather than wishing it away and wishing that we were someone else. Because to God, you're perfect. Because He's the one who formed you in your mother's womb. He knew exactly what He was doing. So instead of comparing yourself to others, try to view yourself the way that God does. His creation, His masterpiece. So Joshua had to overcome comparing himself to others. He had to overcome comparing himself to Moses. He had to overcome the fact that he had to fulfill this man's shoes. But he also had to overcome his fear. Because imagine the fear that he must have faced. The men that he were leading really wasn't prime soldiers at all. The group that he has now has not really done much except for wander through the wilderness for 40 years. They've not really fought in very many combats. And they've always relied on God to give them food and water. And oftentimes they even complained because they didn't get exactly what they wanted. So Joshua had to be fearful about this mission that God had given him. We can kind of get a glimpse of that fear when we look at the way that Moses and God talks to Joshua. In Deuteronomy chapter 1. Moses is telling the people that Joshua is going to succeed him. And that the Lord will go before them and destroy the nations. And he's encouraging the people, telling them to be strong and courageous. But then in verse 8, he says to Joshua in front of all of the people, he says, "It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed." I don't know about you, but if you've got to tell someone not to be fearful, it's probably because they're terrified. They're already fearful, and you're giving them the encouragement that God is there. In Joshua chapter 1, we see God telling Joshua pretty much the same thing, that he is going to give the land into his hands. And we read, this is what God says to Joshua. It says, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success where you go. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be frightened, do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." 3 times in Joshua chapter 1, God tells him, be strong and courageous. God knows exactly what we need. He knew exactly what Joshua needed at this time. He knew that Joshua was fearful. His fear could have been because of the resources that he had, not a very good army or a lack of resources. He could have been afraid because of insecurity. Am I really the type of leader who is able to fulfill this mission? Or he could have been afraid because of a lack of faith. Thinking, I know what God has said, but really, will he really fulfill that? Will he really go before me? We do the same thing. We become fearful to fulfill the mission that God has called us to do. Either we already know what that mission is, we know what God has called us to do, we're just fearful to step out on faith and do it. Or maybe we're too fearful to even look for God's calling. We're afraid that if we really dive in and see what God has wants us to do, that He will send us away to some faraway country to become a missionary. And I don't want to do that. Or maybe He'll send me to the inner cities. I don't want to go there. So we become fearful to even look for our calling. But once we find what our calling is, and we start to fulfill that, that's when our life is finally going to have meaning, finally going to have purpose. For me, my fear was going into full-time ministry. I had insecurities. Could I actually do that? Could I fulfill the role that God has called me to do? I didn't know. And I'll be honest, another part of it was a lack of faith. I didn't think that going into full-time ministry would give me a salary enough to provide for my family. So although I knew what my call was, ever since a sophomore in high school, after high school I went to a technical college and started trying to get a degree in computer-aided drafting. I liked it, I didn't love it. So I switched majors and went to Morehead State University and started getting a degree in business administration with an emphasis in real estate. I liked it, but I didn't love it. And it took me a while to finally step out on faith and say, I know God is going to provide no matter what. He has. And it's when I finally found true meaning and significance for my life. So the question is, how did Joshua overcome his fear? I believe that he knew that God would keep his promise and that God would go before him and be with him. As we look throughout the Old Testament, we see many examples of God's fulfilling exactly what he said he would do. 2 Kings chapter 6, I love the story. Elijah finds himself surrounded by an army. Why he's surrounded by an army? His servant is terrified. And I love what he says in verse 16. Elijah says, do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And I'm thinking that the servant is sitting here thinking, I see who we have. I see who they have. But I'm still fearful. I really don't understand what you mean. And Elijah goes on and it says, then Elijah prayed and said, O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountains was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elijah. The reason Elijah wasn't terrified, he saw the army surrounding him, but he saw God's army surrounding him. No more fear, because he knew God was fighting for him. We look at 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Jehoshaphat is getting terrified because he knows that this multitude of people is coming to him from different nations to attack and destroy them. So he begins to pray. And he says in verse 6, in your hands are power and might, so that none is able to withstand you. So to that prayer, God responds by saying, do not be afraid and do not be dismayed at this great horde. For the battle is not yours, but God's. Stand firm, hold your position, and see the salvation of the Lord on your behalf. Do not be afraid and do not be dismayed. Tomorrow go out against them, and the Lord will be with you. So they begin praising God. And as the multitude of people starts to come to them, God pretty much throws them into confusion, and they begin to fight against each other. And in verse 24, it says, when Judah came to the watchtower of the wilderness, They looked toward the horde, and behold, there were dead bodies lying on the ground. None had escaped. God went before them and fought the battle on their behalf. By the time they got to the battlefield, the battle was already over. Everyone was destroyed. God went before them. God fought against their enemy. You know what amazes me so much about Joshua's faith is that he didn't have these stories as a source of encouragement. Yeah, he did see God deliver the people from Egyptian slavery. But he never seen the extent of what it means that God will fight on our behalf. Yet we have. And we need to take encouragement in passages like these, knowing that God does fight for us. And we may not see the angels surrounding our enemies, but we can rest assured that they are there and that they are fighting on our behalf. Remember, our fight is not against flesh and blood, but it's against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. We can also know that God goes before us and he prepares the way. That doesn't mean that the road will always be easy. That means that he is working in other people's heart. He is working in our heart, preparing us for the battles that we will face. For me, I know that there have been a couple of meetings that I was getting ready to go to that honestly I was not looking forward to at all. Just knowing that going to it was going to end up just being horrible. Everybody was going to leave upset with each other. Nothing was going to get resolved. So I became fearful. I began to worry constantly. Then I would get up, I would go to the meeting, and it seemed like something had changed. It's like God was at work. Maybe the one who was upset or the ones who were upset was no longer upset. And the meeting went great, and everything that we came there to talk about or to discuss was resolved. You know, oftentimes I think we look at the Old Testament stories and we see God working there, but we don't fully believe that he's still working in our lives today. But he is. It might not always look the same. But he's still working. And he's still going before us. Many of you may remember the classic story by Jack London called White Fang. White Fang was half dog and half wolf. And of course, he was very fond of chicken. And on one occasion, he raided a chicken roost and he killed more than 50 hens. And his master, Weedon Scott, whom White Fang absolutely loved and seen as a man god, scolded Fang and he took him to the chicken yard. And White Fang saw all of his favorite food walking around in front of him. So of course he obeyed his natural impulse and he began to lunge at one of the chickens, but immediately his master put him in check. And they stayed there for quite some time in the chicken yard. And every time that White Fang would try to jump at one of the chickens, his master would scold him and stop him. And in that way, he learned what his master wanted. He learned to ignore the chickens. And Wheaton finally decided to test him on this, to test him on his training. So he locked him in the chicken coop all day. So here he is locked in the chicken yard. He's deserted by his master. But he lays down and he goes to sleep. Once he wakes up, he goes to the trough, he drinks a little bit of water, he calmly ignores all of the chickens. White Fang had a choice. He could obey his inborn desire. I mean, let's face it. He's locked in a chicken coop with his favorite food and they had nowhere to go. Or, out of love for his master, he could obey his will and choose not to follow his inborn desire. One of the passages that's most well known in Joshua is Joshua 24:15, where he says, "Choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." We have the same choice. We can either obey or disobey. Remember, there's really only two choices in the matter. Will you decide to serve the Lord, or will you decide to serve your own desires? If you want to make the same choice and the same decision that Joshua did, for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Make that today. Whatever your decision is, come now as we